Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Miles. I'm a board member of the Financial Writers and, as mentioned, chairman of the Impact Award Committee. I'm going to interview Emily Baker-White for about 40 minutes. And then after that, for 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to allow the audience to ask questions. If you just tell your organization and your name before you ask the question, that would be very helpful. Now, as you all know, Emily Baker-White produced a long string of scoops about TikTok and ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, about major privacy breaches. And they just swirled around the internet, changed the conversation about TikTok, and led to major changes in the United Kingdom, also the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. Now, you could call that impact. Now, with that said, I want to welcome Emily Baker-White, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Of course, it's an honor to be here.
Okay, Emily, before we get to your many scoops, I wanted to ask you about how you became a financial journalist, because as you and I have discussed, you first studied music at Oberlin, then you graduated from Harvard Law School, clerked for a judge, then you worked in the policy departments at Facebook and Spotify, and then moved on to BuzzFeed News. How did you end up at BuzzFeed News?
I obviously had a really circuitous route to journalism. Anyone out there who's not a journalist who thinks you might want to be, you can do it. I did. And I would say I have always tried to do the thing that I think will make impact in the world and move the conversation to a better place. And that's what ultimately led me to journalism. I went to law school because I wanted to make the world a better place, make the world a more just place. And after law school, I got a job as a federal public defender in Philadelphia defending guys on death row. And I thought that was it. I thought that was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was incredible. It was meaningful. I always thought I was on the right side of whatever I was doing, because I don't think the state should kill people. And I loved that job. But when I was in that job, I stumbled upon a really weird set of circumstances that I became obsessed with. In one of my cases, I investigated a police brutality claim, which was not uncommon for death row cases. And in investigating the police brutality claim, I found, this is back in 2015, I found that a number of the police officers that I was investigating had public Facebook accounts where they were posting some really weird stuff. And the stuff that got my attention was posts from meme accounts. And they were sort of violent police meme accounts that were talking about doing violence to protesters, doing violence to people who were accused but maybe not convicted of crimes. Maybe they were convicted of crimes, whatever. The police shouldn't be doing violence to them unnecessarily. And they were celebrating that violence, and they were celebrating a sort of discrimination against the people who they were supposed to be protecting and serving. And I saw this and I thought, whoa, how much more of this is out there on the internet? How much more of this is out there on Facebook? And this is before we started having a national conversation about Facebook and radicalization and sort of a lot of the sort of right-wing filter bubbles that we were seeing on Facebook. We hadn't had that national conversation yet, and I was just overcome by the weirdness of the online subculture that I'd found myself in. And so I went out to find out how much more of this stuff was out there. And the answer was a whole lot. I got some funding from a person who knew a person who funded criminal justice projects. And with the help of a really excellent team, we reviewed hundreds of thousands of one member of that team is in the audience. We reviewed hundreds of thousands of Facebook posts to see just how many posts by police officers and former police officers were engaging with this type of content, and the answer was a lot. What I was doing at that moment was journalism. It was absolutely journalism. Being a journalist now, there's like no doubt in my mind. But I didn't know that at the time. I was just a lawyer doing a research project. But doing that project didn't immediately make me want to be a journalist. It made me totally obsessed with big tech and with Facebook in particular. Why was this platform a place where a seemingly alarmingly large number of America's police officers were being radicalized into really weird subcultures, violent subcultures, racist subcultures, right? And I couldn't get my mind off of that. And so I abandoned what would have been a really wonderful career as a lawyer, and I went to work in Facebook's policy department. And I showed up at Facebook and I said, guys, you'll never believe it. There's this really, really crazy stuff happening with America's cops on Facebook. And I was a little bit naive. They knew perhaps more about that than I thought they did. And they drew different lines than I would have drawn.
You said you became disillusioned while you were at Facebook and then eventually moved on to Spotify, right?
Yeah, I would say I got an education in big tech policy decision making. Wouldn't trade it for the world. I learned a lot. But at the end of the day at Facebook, and then I quit my job at Facebook and went and did similar work at Spotify. At both of those companies, ultimately, as a person in the policy department, my job was to serve the bottom line of those companies. And that's not really what I wanted to do.
Let's jump ahead to you going to BuzzFeed after that, okay? Because how did your experiences at Spotify and at Facebook, to what extent did they prepare you for what to look for at TikTok in terms of how big tech companies operate, where to look for information?
Yeah, I mean, so spending years inside these tech companies, I decided I essentially wanted to do conquer exactly the same sort of questions and ideas as I was doing when I was at these companies. But I wanted to ask these questions and answer these questions in the public interest rather than asking and answering them on behalf of big tech. And so I took a big risk and I applied for a job as a journalist at BuzzFeed News. And my intrepid editor, who is not here today, very sadly, because he is quite ill, took a big risk on me and hired me at BuzzFeed. And in hiring me at BuzzFeed, he saw that I was a person who had a lot of expertise about big tech and how it worked. And I was a person that wanted to hold big tech accountable and really sort of dig into how they were making decisions and why they were making decisions. And that expertise that I got from being inside these companies really naturally did translate when it came to figuring out how to report on them, hold them accountable, and have a smarter conversation as a polity about what big tech means.
Let's talk about your blockbuster story at BuzzFeed News. You did a lot of stories at BuzzFeed about TikTok, but then you did the one that said that leaked audio from 80 internal TikTok meetings showed that U.S. user data has been repeatedly accessed from China. I mean, I would read that story. How long did it take you to report that story, and how did you report it?
So we're mostly journalists here, and journalists know that reporting begets more reporting. That story was not my first story about TikTok. My first story about TikTok got far less attention, but it was still really important because it was building sourcing and building a beat. I set out to cover TikTok at BuzzFeed News because we thought no one had really done deep, interesting investigative reporting on the company yet, and it was huge. And so I went and brute force blitzed a huge number of employees at TikTok, current and former. And I said, hey, I'd love to learn more about what it's like to work at TikTok, about how TikTok makes its decisions, about what TikTok thinks the most important issues for TikTok are. And I started talking to a bunch of people who worked at TikTok, and they kept telling me about a big secret project called Project Texas. And when you're a journalist, anytime someone tells you about a secret project with a code name, it's like the best thing ever. Big tech loves code names. They code name everything. They code name the most boring stuff. But nonetheless, I was like, okay, tell me about the secret project, please. And then you get a few people and you ask more people to confirm details of the secret project. The secret project was called Project Texas. And it was this big effort within TikTok to recalibrate how access controls within the company worked. Now, access controls are not inherently sexy, but the reason they were trying to do this is essentially because TikTok knew that too many people had access to too many things inside TikTok. And they knew that with a big multinational company, that could mean Chinese access to US user data. So I wrote a story about Project Texas saying, hey, TikTok's working on this project. But then, again, most of us are journalists, I got an email after I published that story, said, Project Texas, want more? We always want more. Like, this whole thing is luck, right? And when you get an email saying, the secret project you wrote about, I have more details about it, that is like the best day of your month. I did want more. And so I started talking to the person who sent me that email. And eventually, that person told me that they had audio recordings, many audio recordings from meetings at TikTok. And they weren't willing to share those audio recordings with me right away, but we had more conversations, we developed a rapport, and eventually that person was willing to share those recordings with me. And as soon as they did, to sort of answer a question you asked 5 minutes ago, how did my work at Facebook and Spotify inform my reporting on TikTok? These were really weedsy meetings. But I knew a lot of the acronyms that they were talking about. I knew the really weedsy sort of the content moderators working for the content moderation company, liaising with the trust and safety department inside the company, who's then escalating their decisions to other people inside the company. And I was able to see what it meant fairly quickly. And what all these meetings showed was there was a secret project called Project Texas, and it was important. But it was important because as the systems were developed at TikTok, everything was accessible by people in China.
Emily, one thing I wanted to, maybe you could tell our audience, and this always struck me, is how did you confirm that the 80 leaked audios were actual TikTok meetings? Because they could have been fake, or some of the lines could have been faked. You mentioned that a lot of the meetings included people speaking in Chinese or Mandarin, and although you had translators, but you wouldn't even know if the translator was accurate. How did you figure that out?
Very carefully. One of my dear former colleagues at BuzzFeed and Forbes used to say, always stay paranoid, and she was not wrong. We should be paranoid as journalists. There are people who will try to set us up. There are people who are trying to send us false information. We've seen that. This happens in the world today. And so you have to assume that everyone who approaches you has bad intent, basically, which is like a sad fact, but we need to confirm everything. And so here I was sitting with a huge corpus of information, a huge corpus of audio that I wanted to confirm was real. Luckily, from the past story that I'd done where I'd went and talked to all those TikTok employees, those people became really important because in these audio tapes, first of all, there were lots of people in the audio tapes, and I could ask my other sources questions about these people, what they talked about, what they worked on, what they knew, and sort of confirm the existence of the people, confirm that the people do in fact work on this thing. The other thing that was really useful and important is that inside big tech, and this is the thing I knew from working inside big tech, people are working on a zillion internal tools all the time. And all those internal tools have special names that you don't know if you don't work there. And so I began to ask my sources from the first story, hey, have you heard of this tool? Have you heard of Aeolus? Have you heard of Dorado? Have you heard of, salmon and tuna? And I'm listing TikTok tools that mean nothing to you guys, but they mean a lot to people who work at TikTok. And they were like, oh yeah, that one I've worked on, that one I know, that one I heard someone mention once, but I don't know. But if you get enough independent people who don't know each other, who don't know that other people are talking, to say, yeah, I worked on that, I worked on this, did you work on this initiative, were you in this meeting, right? You can sort of start to triangulate. And you do that more with the stuff that's really important. 80 hours of audio, a lot of it was boring. But you've got to take the nuggets in there and really try to confirm them with enough certainty that you know you're not getting played.
Okay, now that was your big, I call your big whale at BuzzFeed News. Let's move on to Forbes, where you also published a long list of scoops. Dear, I'm sure, the people in this room. There are two stories that I really liked. Story number one of your biggest scoops revealed that TikTok planned to spy on American citizens by obtaining their IP addresses and tracking their physical movements. Story number two A second huge story, you confirm the earlier story about reporting that TikTok had been spying on 3 Forbes reporters, including you, and also a reporter from the Financial Times. How did you find out that you were likely to be spied on and were being spied on?
Yeah, so this is like the least satisfying answer ever, but I can't tell you that much in order to protect sources. But this is a story in like weird reporting and holding things back to protect sources, actually, because we knew when we published the first story that we were the targets of the story, but our source wasn't comfortable with us saying that. And so we said, okay, what are you comfortable with us saying? What is a level of vagueness that you are comfortable with us saying that's also accurate? And we very, very carefully worked with the sources on that story to make sure that what we were saying was definitely correct and would not out them or would not make them feel unsafe. And working with anonymous sources is really tricky. It's also an absolute core to what we do as investigative journalists. And when I've talked to really smart people who talk about how to develop sourcing, you have to meet your sources where they're at. And your sources are going to have really like idiosyncratic desires. They're going to have weird OPSEC habits. Some of their weird OPSEC habits aren't even gonna make any sense, and that doesn't matter. You have to understand what they are comfortable with, meet them where they are, make sure that what you're doing is always ethical and always keeps you safe and keeps them safe to the best of your ability. But then you also have to understand what they're comfortable with and what risks they're comfortable taking. And we worked really carefully with our sources on this story and figured out sort of exactly what they were comfortable with us saying. And then, so we report the story. TikTok comes out on Twitter that night and impugns our integrity and says that we're lying. We stand by our story because, like, we have the sourcing that we have and we're comfortable in saying what happened. And so we sort of say on Twitter, we stand by our story. We know what happened here. Then TikTok and its parent company ByteDance, which really sort of operate as one entity most of the time, at least at that point, they bring in big gun lawyers from Covington and say, hey, we want you to investigate why these reporters said this thing was true. If I were TikTok, I probably would have done that before I came out on Twitter impugning people's integrity, but that's not the choice they made. And the lawyers go and do an investigation internally and find out sort of exactly what we reported, which was that there was this plan, and the plan was that they wanted to use the TikTok app on my phone and my colleagues' phones to figure out where we were at any given moment, and then to cross-reference the IP addresses from our phones with the IP addresses from thousands of ByteDance employees to see if we were in the same cafe, in the same park, if we joined the same Wi-Fi network type of stuff. That's crazy. It also, by the way, they were surveilling us, but they were also surveilling all their employees when they were doing that in order to try to catch leakers. And so we knew that there had been this plan to do this. Covington, the law firm, goes and does an internal investigation and finds out that not only was there a plan, which is what we'd reported because that's what we knew, but this had actually happened on several occasions. They had actually pulled the data. And TikTok essentially does a mea culpa at this point. It's December 22nd, 2022. December 22nd is a great day to bury any news that you might not want people to pay a lot of attention to. As we know, we assume that everyone is gonna be like eating pies and watching football, which I hope everyone was doing. But I personally was talking to sources that morning because TikTok comes out and tells their employees that this has happened and people have been fired, right? And when TikTok comes out and says that, the things that we already knew several months beforehand about the surveillance plot that we had uncovered, our sources were comfortable with us going with more of that information. And so we were able to say things in December because our sources were comfortable with us saying those things that we weren't able to say in October. And again, you gotta meet people where you're at. You gotta ask them again and again, are you comfortable with us using this fact? Are you comfortable with us using that fact? Or do you feel protected in the situation? And the facts weren't different. They were the same, it was the same set of facts, but the situation around those facts had changed. And so our source sort of let us report more of that in December.
Emily, when you were being spied on, and when you knew you were being spied on, what did you do to protect yourself and additional steps that you took to protect your sources? One thing you said is I ripped the TikTok app off my phone.
I took
That's
TikTok
one thing you did.
off my phone real
but
fast.
in addition to that, what did you do?
I mean, I promptly told all of my sources that we knew that this was a concern. Other people on my team also took TikTok off their phone. And again, there's only so many things that we can do to keep ourselves and our sources as safe as we possibly can. But I never want to be the reason anyone is identified when they don't want to be identified. And so use encrypted messaging apps where you can. I've had sources who want to meet without devices. That's fine. When you're a woman, that's like a little interesting sometimes, but you find ways, you use public places, right? You figure out what people are worried about. This is, I and a couple of my colleagues went to a training several years ago, put on by BuzzFeed and the New York Times on sort of adversarial reporting. And at this training, they were saying, you have to know what you're afraid of. You have to know what you're worried about. And initially, I was like, okay, well, this seems like a silly exercise. But it's actually really important, right? Because if you're worried about being surveilled by a company, you're going to have one set of concerns. If you're worried about being surveilled by the Chinese government, you're going to have another set of concerns. If you're worried about being surveilled by the US government, there are other things that you're not going to want to do, right? And so you really have to identify the people that you're worried about, the people that you're worried about finding you or finding your sources, punishing you or punishing your sources. And then you have to go from there and think, okay, what are the choices in my control that I can take to ensure that I keep these people as safe as I possibly can?
Yeah, I think you also mentioned, or you may have already said about the idea that you would go back several decades and just meet somebody somewhere without an electronic device and just a notebook.
Yeah.
That was a common strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There are some people who want to meet with no devices. And that's great. We have notebooks. We can do that. There are a lot of people who aren't comfortable being recorded, and that's totally fine. There are other people who would rather be recorded. They want to make sure that you get their quote exactly right, right? And like, you just have to understand that there are a lot of people with a lot of idiosyncratic lines that they want to draw. And you have to sort of move through the journalistic process with integrity, no matter what those lines are, but again, figuring out how you can work with that person to make sure that they can tell you what they want to tell you.
You know, there are a lot of journalists here in this audience who work on very aggressive investigative stories. Should they work on the assumption that they may be tracked in terms of IP addresses or other, or other equipment? And how do you protect yourself in general? Any 3 or 4 steps that you would recommend? Yeah,
I mean, there are a lot of instances of companies tracking journalists when companies shouldn't track journalists. There are a lot of instances of governments tracking journalists when they shouldn't be tracking journalists. But that's not a reason not to do our work. That's a reason to do our work harder. That's a reason why our work is really, really necessary. And so I would say you can't be afraid, right? You can't say, I might be tracked, ergo I'm not going to pursue this story. I might be tracked, ergo I'm not going to pursue this company. That's what they want. And you can't do that. You have to say, are you kidding me? You tried to use my IP address to figure out who my sources are? Okay, you're my beat for the next year and a half, right? That's what you have to do. When companies when companies target journalists, that is a sign that they need more reporting, not less. And governments, by the way, too. Anybody who is trying that hard to make sure a story doesn't get out, there's a pretty good story under there. You should go look.
Okay. We're going to move at a slower pace and talk about your book now.
Okay.
Okay, Emily's book. You're now working on a book on TikTok, scheduled for publication this fall by W.W. Norton. The current title is Every Screen on the Planet, The War Over TikTok, The Rise of the Most Effective Attention Algorithm Ever Invented, and the Superpower Struggle to Control It. How did a book evolve from your reporting? Did you plan to do a book?
At the beginning, I didn't plan to do a book, and then one thing led to another, and the company tried to surveil me, and they were doing a lot of other sort of wild stuff
You
that
mean
I was
TikTok?
hearing.
TikTok, okay.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I was hesitant to write a book initially. I thought, am I really the right person to tell this story? Is there really, you know, is this the right story for me to tell? And this is really one that came to me. Sometimes a story comes to you, and like whether you like it or not, you become the person on that beat, and that is absolutely what happened to me. And when that happens, seize the opportunity, talk to some agents, because it may be just what is supposed to happen, and that's what I feel like happened to me.
As you told me, you said, then TikTok spied on me, and I'm the TikTok girl now.
I didn't intend to be the TikTok girl, guys, and then they went and spied on me, and now I'm the TikTok girl, so I wrote a book. Yeah, that's how it happened. That's pretty much how it went down.
Tell us about how you chose a publisher, how you chose W.W. Norton.
I was really fortunate to get connected to a very good agent early, before I even knew I wanted to write a book. And he was very patient with me. We had a series of conversations where we sort of talked through what a book would look like, the argument for writing a book, the arguments for not writing a book. And eventually we decided to write a proposal, and we did. And then he said, okay, I can blast this out to all the publishers out there, or I can approach a very small number of publishers, or I can approach sort of a medium small number of publishers. And we went with the sort of medium small. He knew the people in the industry. I didn't, but I was very lucky to have him. And so he approached a sort of small number of editors at publishers that he knew who might be interested in the book. And then I had meetings with a number of those editors, and they were all very good, but there was one who clearly got me and got what I thought about TikTok that much more clearly than the others. And that is the editor at the publisher that I went with, and that is the editor on my book. And I really, for anyone considering writing a book or trying to decide between publishers or editors, if there's someone who gets you and knows what you're trying to say, all the others can be great, they can be fancy, they can be big names, it doesn't matter. Go with the person who gets you, because having someone who understands and shares and believes in what you're trying to explain to the world is like so much more important than all the rest.
I'm wondering what kind of adjustment was it from moving from writing even in-depth stories for Forbes to doing a long-form book? I mean, what was your schedule, your writing schedule?
I wrote a chapter every weekend. I don't recommend this to anyone, except I do. It was really terrible. I didn't have a weekend off for like a year. But it was worth it. And if you are considering writing a book, it is a huge number of words, and you just have to assume that they're all gonna suck for a while. And so you write a chapter every weekend, and it's really bad. And it's okay, it's really bad, and you're just like, okay, that exists, I'm gonna come back to it later. And then the great thing about writing a chapter every weekend, when you're writing magazine stories, you have to look at them basically every day, or at least every other day, or at least every third day. If you have a whole week, you come back and you're like, wow, that was phenomenally bad. And then fairly quickly, you're able to make it a lot better. And just having the time away from each chapter, when you return to the chapter, makes it far more efficient to revise.
Is the book, do you feel, going to be a consolidation, or, you know, of your reporting, or what's it going to tell us that we don't know from your Forbes reporting?
I think writing a book is about explaining the why of a bunch of individual scoops. And the scoops tell you the why. There's a nut graph in every story, or there should be. But sort of taking the arc of a bunch of stuff and saying, hey, here's why you should care about the story of TikTok. Here's why you should care that all of this stuff that you kind of know happened maybe. Here's why it matters and what it means for all sorts of other industries, all sorts of other companies, sorts of other governments, right? Here is why it matters. And I think that's what a good book will add to whatever scoops already exist.
You know, the long-planned sale of TikTok has been delayed by the China-U.S. Tariff war.
Yep.
And it looks like the deadline is going to be pushed back again. What do you think is going to happen to TikTok? Is it going to stay independent and unsupervised, so to speak, or what?
I don't know. The people I talk to don't think anything will materially change very soon unless there is a big US-China deal on a bunch of other stuff, and that doesn't seem likely in the near future. But we don't know. History's still happening.
But does this mean then kind of a lack of transparency that we could end up, it opens a door for a ByteDance spying on, US users of TikTok again?
Well, right now that's not illegal. Like what they did to me was very bad form, but it's not clear that they broke any laws. And so if you're concerned about exactly how tech companies can use their apps to monitor the locations of their users or what have you, you should probably take that up with Congress. Because right now, it's not clear that they're not allowed to do that. And our Congress has not passed a national security law. Now, the interesting thing about TikTok is they did pass a law on TikTok, and that law is currently being ignored. But
well, that's what I mean. So if you're a reporter, it's still a risk, a potential risk.
yeah, I would say actually that's a risk for more than just TikTok. That's a risk for a lot of companies because we don't have a national privacy law. But it's also a risk for TikTok. They've done it before, and right now, there's nothing except their word, which, hey, they fired the people who did this, that's good. But right now, we have to take them at their word that they're not gonna violate people's privacy, the same way we have to take other companies at their word, and it's not clear to me that that's a winning strategy.
Okay, now we'll take some questions from the audience. Any questions?
I have a question. Callum from The Real Deal. That original source you had about Project Texas was hesitant about handing over the 80 hours of audio to you. You eventually convinced them to hand them over. What was your strategy there, if you had one? And was there ever a moment where you felt like you could have lost them?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it was luck, I think. Part of it was just hearing people and hearing people talk about what they think is important, even when it's not what you think is important. I think you have to, there's a person out there who went to the effort to record all of these meetings. You really gotta take the time to understand why. And there's another thing here, which is that you and your source are not always gonna agree about what's important. That happens all the time. We see that all the time. But if the information is solid, that sort of doesn't matter. But when it comes to just developing a source relationship, before you talk about how you're gonna write your story, people wanna be heard, people wanna feel trusted. This source, unsurprisingly, had a lot of idiosyncratic OPSEC feelings. Many of them do, and I really tried to hear those and honor those, and I think that helped. But could they have ended up with another journalist at another outlet? Very easily.
Michael?
Hi, Emily. Were you ever worried that someone was trying to set you up with these, recordings, not to kind of attack you, BuzzFeed or Forbes, but potentially to attack TikTok?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many sources. I mean, frankly, every source who comes to us has a motivation. They want their narrative out there for some reason. And sometimes it's because they work for a competitor of the company, right? We see that all the time. We see competitors try to seed doubt about their competitors. We see disgruntled people who just hate the people they used to work with, right? We see unstable people who believe conspiracy theories. We see people with a grudge against a government. We see people who are just racist. We see all kinds of stuff, right? And it's our job as journalists to, A, understand why someone is giving us something, and B, Figure out if it's true. And I think those two things are really important. If what people are giving us is true, we then have to make our own sort of news assessment with our editors about like whether that thing is something we should report, right? We can get true information that we're just like, yeah, this might be true, but it's not really newsworthy and it's kind of gross that this person gave it to us, right? And like, you don't have to report that story if that's what you have. But you could also have like a person with terrible motive who gives you something that you then really report out that's also true, and you have to figure out what to do about that. And so I think we just have to, everybody has a motive. Our motive should be presenting newsworthy information to the public in as a responsible and ethical way as we can. And we've got to understand that sources' motivations are very often fraught for whatever reason. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes you just get a person who's like, I didn't think this was right, and I wanted to raise it to you because I don't think it's right. And like, that's the easiest person, but most of us are more complicated than that most of the time.
Peter Coy? I'll get you next time.
Am I at the corner? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but two questions for you, Emily. First, how do you review hundreds of thousands of Facebook posts? I don't even know.
Michael Noor, really? Oh God, it was complicated,
I'm
yeah.
asking you because I'm in the corner and I can't ask more. And so the second question is, working for a place like Facebook, or I'm not sure the role of Spotify, but organizations with many tens of thousands of employees, how does that compare to working at a place like BuzzFeed or Forbes that are much smaller? What is the day-to-day difference?
All right, I'm gonna take these in order. How do you review hundreds of thousands of Facebook posts? This is a reference to the Plainview Project, the police accountability project that I mentioned earlier. So there's a person in the audience who helped me do this. Yeah, I sure am. He's now my fiance. The tech director of the Plainview Project, which I ran, and I went and contracted with this person who I am now marrying, built a Facebook scraper. He built a scraper that went into Facebook and captured all of the public comments made by people we had identified as law enforcement officers, and identifying people as law enforcement officers was extremely annoying. We had to FOIA for people's names and faces and then match their names and faces and badge numbers to the people who were like had Facebook accounts. But we had this list of people that we had verified were law enforcement officers. I didn't hear that. And we then, Adam went and captured all the public Facebook posts made by those people. Those were loaded into a tool that Adam made, which we referred to as Cop Tinder, where an image would load. It would be an image of a pie, swipe left. Image of a baseball game, swipe left. Image of a Confederate flag, swipe right, and so on for hundreds of thousands of images. That is how we've sorted hundreds of thousands of images.
I mean, hours, right?
Hundreds of like months, Michael. And it wasn't just me. I was running a team of 14 contract workers doing this.
I got it.
Yeah, it took a really, really, really long time. I forget your second question. Oh,
Just the difference
team size.
Yeah, the scale, like when you talk about working in policy at a place like Facebook, which has
Yeah.
100,000 employees, and then you work at a place, whatever, I mean, 60,000, I don't know what
Yeah.
it was. And then you work at a place like Forbes where, you know, you or I could make policy overnight without asking anybody, right?
I don't know if that's quite true, but I'm happy to test it with you. We should talk. I don't know. I've worked at really big places. I've worked at really small places. I think there's great benefit to both. But being overruled a lot at Facebook definitely made me want to leave. I'll say that.
Peter Coy?
Yeah, so you must have benefited from your legal training and your experience at Facebook and Spotify. The question, though, is the other way around. Could you have done this without those experiences?
Yeah, I think so. I think everybody has relevant experiences. We don't talk a lot about my experience and training as a classical violist, but I think that also totally helps define who I am. And everybody has stuff that they're good at that they do that they don't talk about so much because it's not immediately clear how it's relevant to who they become, but it usually actually is really helpful. If you're really good at restoring old furniture, or you're really good at a sport, right? Like, anyone who's been a serious athlete knows that that is like inside your brain all the time. It affects how you work. It affects how you think. And I don't know, like, bring your whole self to work, I guess. Like, there's so much to all of us that enable us to do things that we don't necessarily think about in the workplace. And I've just had like a bunch of weird career experiences that sort of have summed up to investigative journalism, but so has everyone here. Even if yours aren't the same as mine, they're gonna exist, and they're gonna be really powerful, actually, and just like figure out how to tell that story and to tell it.
Go ahead, yes.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I'm an intern with Bloomberg News, and I wanted to ask you about, like, is there a particular platform or issue within tech right now that you feel like isn't being sufficiently covered or investigated?
There's a book in weird, scammy affiliate marketing. There's a really good book in weird, scammy affiliate marketing. It's just enormous and very strange. Other like tech-related beats that are undercovered. I'll get back to you. It's a really good question. I'll get back to you.
Go ahead.
Well, Ron, just a fan of your reporting going back to the horrific discovery of the police department there. I was just wondering, it was very similar to Corey's question, but how many times did your lawyer's trigger go off when you're having these conversations about conversations being recorded? And I'm not familiar with the law.
Yeah. I was in California at the time. It was spicy. I don't know how much y'all know about two-party consent states,
Exactly.
but yeah.
Because it's federated, right? So
I
you can
didn't
be in one
record
state,
them?
It's legal, another state it's not legal.
Yeah, no, I know. I would say my lawyer brain goes off all the time, and sometimes it's wrong, right? Like, one thing about lawyering is that I tell everybody that the one thing I learned in law school, when they come up to me and they're like, hey, I have this legal question, I'm like, ooh, you should get a lawyer. That's all I actually know, is that everybody should talk to lawyers about all their problems. Because I am not a specialist in any type of law anymore. And most lawyers are not specialists in other types of law. And so, yeah, there are definitely questions about the legality of the recordings, but there weren't really questions about the legality of us reporting on them once they were given to us. And so, you know, yeah. My lawyer brain goes off all the time, and mostly I just ping Jess, who's our lawyer, who's in the audience, and I'm like, hey, how do we feel about this? But I generally... Everybody, talk to your lawyers more about your stories. First of all, they're like really smart and passionate and have interesting ideas, but also they will make your stories better. I have had some stories, mostly thinking before I was at Forbes, that were like hellaciously lawyered, and it made them so much better. And it almost always does, right? You want to get really crisp about your sourcing. You want to get really crisp about exactly how you know what you know and exactly how you phrase it. And so, like, I know some people are kind of scared of getting their stories lawyered. Don't be scared. Embrace the lawyers. More lawyers all the time.
Okay.
What was the public reaction to your stories, particularly given how popular TikTok is with the general population?
A lot of people were displeased. I don't really know what more to say. I mean, a lot of lawmakers were very displeased. TikTok's executives and lobbyists were, for a long time, they answered a slightly different question than they were asked. They were asked sort of, is our data safe from potential misuse by people in China or the Chinese government? And they would say, oh, the data is stored in the United States and overseen by a US access control team. And that wasn't the question they were asked, right? It wasn't like, hey, could these people access this data? It was, oh, the data's in the United States. Well, yeah, it's in the United States, but if you can like query it from wherever, I don't care where it is. I don't know where my Gmail things are stored. I just know I can access them wherever I am in the world, right? And so I think people felt misled, whether there was a direct clear lie or not, lawmakers felt misled. And misleading people is a problem.
So you talked about how, Kirk, by the way, and you talked about how sometimes your sources wanted to like tell a different story. Like
Yeah.
you were going like they don't actually understand what was important, right? And you talked about listening to them throughout that process. What was it like when you published your story and the source was like, maybe that's not one of those important
Yeah.
things I made. And yeah, what was the conversation like post?
That's super real. And you bring up an important point, which is that, like, we do ultimately decide how to write a story. We also shouldn't be too cocky in knowing, like, what is important. When we have sources who are inside companies and they tell us, like, this thing matters, this thing is important, it's our job to listen. And, like, sometimes you get an unstable person or a person with a huge grievance, and, like, you've got to factor that in. But the more sources you have and the more people you're talking to, the more you can actually sort of figure out what is important and really sort of learn as a journalist. I think when we get too cocky about knowing what's important, that's a problem too. But yeah, there are always going to be sources who would rather, sources would like to write the articles themselves, and they don't get to do that. And they would always do it a little bit differently, right? And sometimes they would do it a lot differently. And we have a no surprises process for companies, subjects of stories. Like, we always want to make sure we tell them everything's going to be in the story and give them a chance to respond to it. I often tell sources that I have a no surprises process with sources before I have no process with the company, or before I have no surprises with the company. Like, I don't want sources to be surprised either. And so if someone has told you something and you come back and say, hey, like, you've told me this thing, I really want to report it, I'm really happy that you told me so that I can report it. Here are some other things, like, what are your thoughts on those things? And so, like, I never want a source to be totally shocked when they read a story. And it's also, like, if you can go back to them and say, like, what do you think about this, though? Like, these other people said this, like, what do you make of that, right? Like, it's a way of, A, making sure they're not surprised, but B, also maybe getting some more information.
What did your sources do that earned your trust in them? Because you've said a lot of this person maybe seems unstable, or this person has an axe to grind. But even if they did, what sort of feelers did you have that say, I can trust their information or I can trust them regardless?
So the simplest answer to that is you need to corroborate the information. And so a person tells you a really spicy thing, that's fun. But you can't run it unless somebody else tells you, or you see it in a document, or preferably 3 more people tell you, and you see it in 5 documents. Like, the more you have, the better. And you do come, like, if you have a source who you've been working with for years, who's given you 200 documents and 5 scoops and never been wrong, you're going to take that person more seriously. But even then, you need to figure out how to corroborate the information. And the other thing is, like, you do need to divorce the information from the person. Like, a person tells you a thing. That is true or not true, and you can go get it from other people. It's corroborable, and if you can't corroborate it, you probably can't run it. And so you try to be a good person to all the people who are talking to you always, especially, like, I am not the only person in my newsroom who has dealt with really tough sources, people who have really serious, like, mental health concerns, people who have all kinds of shit, and just try to be a good person. And, like, if being a good person, I know people who've had this problem, if being a good person loses you a scoop, be a good person. Don't choose scoop over good personness. And I think that is your first duty. And then your second duty is to the information, corroborating the information, trying to figure out, is this true? Is this half the story? Is there something else I really need to know here in order to be fair to everybody? And, like, if you can do that and also be a decent person, you're golden.
Carolyn, and then we'll get you next.
Yes, hi, I'm Carolyn with Decision Built Intelligence. Someone mentioned the demographic of TikTok. Now, I
Oh,
I don't think anyone over, I don't think like government officials, I mean, I'm not saying anything about right now, but I don't think a lot of government officials and business leaders were on TikTok. I mean, using it, yes, but.
you'd be surprised. But yeah, I mean, TikTok is known as a very young platform, but there are a lot of people of a lot of different age groups and demographics on TikTok now. But to answer your other question, the spying that I discussed was like a very specific leak investigation that happened to me. It happened to this woman, Christina Criddle, at the Financial Times. That was not a thing that they did to users writ large. That was a thing that they did to try to figure out who was talking to reporters.
There's one more question after this, if there's one, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
I'm a former reporter. I covered North Korea for about a decade, so I'm really interested in what you think the end game is here with the Chinese government involved. I mean, what is the purpose of gathering U.S. civilian data? Because it's not, it's something that happens beneath the surface. It's an invisible force in our lives, and it also is part of the interweb, the complex into U.S.-China relations, and it's just I'm just curious what you think is the end game from the Chinese perspective.
So a couple things. I mean, it sort of, I want to be clear about who we're talking about, whose end game we're talking about, right? There's this company, right, that is ByteDance, that makes TikTok, that owns TikTok, and ByteDance is a hugely profitable, huge, massive company. They're really interested in AI. They're really interested in the sort of way they were foundational to the idea that people go on the internet and search for information. There's a better way. Let the information search for you, right? And sort of that's how ByteDance changed our orientation with the internet from what in big tech they call a push surface, where you push information, away from pull surfaces, where sorry, I did a really bad job of explaining that. In big tech, they talk about push surfaces and pull surfaces. Push surfaces are surfaces where the company pushes information to you. Pull surfaces are things like Google search, where you pull information from it. And it used to be that we all went on the internet and pulled information that we were interested in. And in the last 5, 8, maybe 10 years, that's flipped. And now we go on the internet, we just go on the internet and we receive stuff, right? And ByteDance was really early to that. They were early to that with TikTok, but they were early to that with their other companies too. And so that's ByteDance's endgame. ByteDance's founder thinks that they can serve you information more effectively than you can search for it yourself. And that's what they want. And they want money. They want money and they want power. They're tech bros, right? Like all the tech bros want money and power. And so that's their endgame. But then they're the endgames of governments too. And you've got Xi Jinping, who also wants money and power. You've got Donald Trump, who definitely wants money and power, right? And in a way, I mean, I do think that is the end game for everybody, and the question is just who has the most leverage over the most tech companies. And, you know, the AI companies too, they want money and power. They're just digesting the information slightly differently and, again, pushing it back to us, right? We're not so much pulling it. They get to decide what we see, right? And that's a loss of power for consumers and for, like, regular humans trying to understand. I liked it better when we got to decide what information we wanted instead of some algorithm magically deciding it for us.
We have one final question. Sure.
What do you see the final fate of TikTok, given all that's been going on with the U.S. government and keep pushing up the deadlines? Where do you see this ending up, and when do you see it ending up?
End is an interesting word. I don't know if we would say Facebook has met its end yet, but it's kind of a zombie platform. I think the big question is whether TikTok meets its end in the same way that other platforms have naturally done so, or whether it meets its end against its will. I guess Mark Zuckerberg isn't really happy that Facebook is zombified either. But it's either going to die a natural death or it's not. And it doesn't seem terribly likely right now, given the political climate, that Trump would enforce the law, given that he has sort of decided that keeping TikTok around is in his interest. That could change, right? But the reason they passed the law is to exert leverage over ByteDance and force ByteDance to sell. Trump has said that he doesn't want TikTok to go away, and so he's removed that leverage. That leverage doesn't exist anymore. If you were ByteDance, why would you sell? There's no incentive to sell. Nobody is making you sell right now. And so, unless and until someone does, I don't think they're gonna.
The final question, Larry Carroll.
Hi, Larry from the New York Financial Writers. What was the end result of your report? Did anything accomplish? Was there any change in anything?
You know, causation is really hard. I would like anyone else in this room to answer that question for me. And some people know why I'm saying that.
I can answer, as I mentioned earlier, that the articles were quoted.
Were there like any legislation?
Some people would say that our reporting caused the law to happen. I don't know that that's true, and we can't run a counterfactual on that, but I would certainly say that our reporting contributed to the fact that a law got passed banning a social media app. And I'm very ambivalent about that because I'm not a huge fan of the law, but some people would say that that was the impact that we had.
There you have it. I'm glad I'm not being investigated by Emily Baker White. But we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank you for joining us. Congratulations on your 2024 Impact Award, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. It was a tutorial.
Thank you so much.